Huge thanks to the panel that just concluded. And I love that the note that we ended on there was empathy. Because this next conversation is about helping all of the sellers in the room actually empathize with the buyers that they are targeting. Super excited to have with us two very seasoned IT leaders today. And Mark and Eric specifically asked me not to spend too much time introducing them, so I'm going to go over their life stories, if that's okay. Mark is a veteran CIO and most recently CIO of Okta. I think you've been a 6-time CIO.
7 times. I'm up to 7.
7-time. Okay, math is wrong there. 7-time CIO at a bunch of different publicly traded companies ranging from tech to healthcare, oil and gas and beyond. In line with the rocket ship theme of our event today, Mark used to dream of being an astronaut in the early days of his career and actually was a NASA program scientist in DC, so I'm glad we could bring you
done your homework.
closer.
I'm very impressed. I'm very impressed.
As if all of that wasn't enough, Mark has also added book author to his quiver of accomplishments, where he published a book called Truth from the Trenches, which is sort of a treatise on IT management. And I've read about half of it, and it's pretty good. So far, so good.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being with us today. And we have Eric Tan here, who is head of IT at Coupa. And Eric leads the systems, processes, and tools for sales, marketing, operations, customer support, and a whole bunch of other sort of functional technology domains within Coupa, and is also responsible for the implementation of Coupa's digital technology within the company itself. And another fascinating and unique aspect of your background, Eric, that I learned from reading one of your interviews is that your dad was a CIO at a bank. So hoping to tap into some multi-generational wisdom today, because this seems to be in your blood. As we go through the conversation today, would love to get your thoughts on a few different areas. One is how you as CIOs and IT leaders think about engaging with startups, because sometimes that can be different from how you engage with a larger IT entity. Also helping the folks in the room understand the selling motion from the customer and the CIO's perspective. And last but not the least, helping the companies in the room really understand how to stay relevant in the enterprise. And so maybe just as a starting point, would love to understand from you, what is the best way for a startup to get in front of you and get access to you as an IT leader with buying authority? Is it warm introductions? Is it showing up on an analyst report? What are the most common ways that startups get on your radar?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Well, for me, I think the best way and what I've seen really successful is really warm introductions. I think when, the CIO community is really small, especially here in the Valley. I think, if you want to get your product out there, everyone talks, right? So if you've had success with a particular organization, with a particular CIO, I would say start there. And, through word of mouth, we usually find out about the ones that are better than the rest, right?
So I think we have to guard against the way we interact here in the Valley to what happens out in the real world, the normal world outside the Bay Area. And so a lot of the informal ways in which we share information here don't get replicated in other markets. So I've worked in a place like Houston, and all the oil and gas guys are on the west side of town. There's a bunch of companies up in the woodlands, and the finance guys are downtown. And there's very little interaction, among the different IT groups. And so you could have like a raging success in the oil and gas industry, and the people in the woodlands have no idea whatsoever that Coupa's the new, the hot new thing. So some of the things that we rely on here really don't work in practice, outside of here. So you have to really understand the dynamics of the local market that you're working in.
Once a startup is actually in the room, they have their foot in the door and they're pitching to you or your leadership teams, what are some of the most common mistakes that startups might make in those first couple of interactions that they get in front of you?
Closing the deal. And in all seriousness, I think one of the biggest turnoffs is, being in the room. And and the reality, and Mark and I share this, right? The reality is we see a lot of pitches, right? That's part of our job. I think part of our job is also to understand and learn about new innovations. And, a lot of the startups that come to pitch to us have a lot of great ideas, right? The question becomes, at what point will it be relevant for a company? So take, for example, Coupa. We're your classic mid-sized company. If I look at the past 2 years, we've grown from 500 employees to 1,500. But if you think about the work that we do, I mean, I also moved from eight officers to 29 officers in the past 2 years. So that's just a lot of work. Now, for you to suggest or to come in and suggest, hey, this technology is going to take 1 month to implement, and it's going to solve all your problems, it begs the question, right? Because I've got to drop everything and do that. So I think the expectation and the reality of trying to close that deal within that first meeting is quite a bit of a turnoff. I think where I've seen companies be really successful is, a sales leader being authentic with a conversation and just being honest. Hey, listen, this is I've had chief revenue officers or even sales reps come in and just say, hey, you know what? It's not the right time for you, but can we revisit this in a year? And I appreciate that, right? We don't waste each other's time, and Mark and I, everyone's busy, and we would just be really transparent on where we are in the process.
So I think in an initial meeting you have a Goldilocks problem in terms of time management, and you're trying to paint this big visionary picture, right? And the vendor, want that CIO to walk away with, I'm seduced by this vision of what this thing would actually do, but you also want some details, and so you have to really be careful. So an example would be, if you go to, like we did at Okta, so one of our investors was Andreessen, and Andreessen runs a fairly large-scale retail operation where they bring in IT organizations from across the U.S. You do something similar and have these briefings and presentations, and so I'm sure you all participate in these as well. So it's kind of a beauty contest thing, and you're going to be rushed in and out in 20, 25 minutes. The people are kind of bewildered because they're going to go through this experience 10 or more times, in a given day, and they've flown in the night before. And so in those kind of situations where the time's compressed, it's really important that they walk away with a vision. You have to emphasize the vision. Now, on the other hand, if you had more time and you were in their offices, they want more than a vision. Like, if they don't want to come out of that meeting going like, what do they, like, that was great, but like, what do they actually do? So in the time that's available, this is one bit of advice. You've got to figure out the balance between the vision versus the details. So that's kind of one. Two is, I find a lot of times I have to ask for the secret sauce, because like I've heard pitches about BI tools and monitoring tools and DevOps tools and whatever, and like just a throwaway reference to machine learning or whatever. Well, that's interesting, but like what do you guys really do? And you can go through like 20, 30 minutes and have no idea, seriously, I mean, at the end of the day. And then I think the third thing to try to accomplish, well, there's actually two. So the third is context. So I love a vendor that comes in and says, here's like a normative framework for your monitoring tools, or here's a normative framework for DevOps, whatever. And this is where we fit in. Like, this is in this whole thing, this is where we fit in. And almost, I'd say more than half the time, myself or my colleagues, towards the end of the conversation, we start peppering the vendor with like, what don't you do? Because every time we kind of like twitch, you go, yeah, we do that. Yeah, we do that. But like, what don't you do? You can't do like all that stuff. It's almost impossible. And then I guess I thought about the fourth one. The fourth one is to try to engage in a conversation during the presentation. Because I think too often, one of the previous speakers talked about, you show up with a slide deck many times, you get trapped by the slide deck, and time's all used up, and everybody's got to rush off to the next meeting. And really early in the presentation, you want to find ways to use the homework that you've hopefully done about the products they're currently using or the companies they've come from or whatever, to really make that more of a conversation and not just the pitch.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mark. It reminds me of a vendor. They're in the communication space who was in our office just this week, and it was an hour-long presentation. It took them, I guess it was 2 months to set up this meeting, but we went like close to 50 minutes of slideware, only to give us 10 minutes of time to get into the product demo. And in all seriousness, most of the times we've already done the homework. We've looked at the website, we get it, right? I mean, we get the breadth of entire product suite as well. But we also, most of the times we're not interested in buying the entire product suite. We've called you in because there's one problem or two problems we really, really want you to solve, right? So get right to it, get into the demo so we can ask the questions. And I think when you get into that engaging scenario, that's where you learn the problems that you're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So there's been some talk in different sessions today about really giving the customer and the evangelist, sort of on the customer organization side, a sense for the product. And we have a lot of companies in our portfolio, and I think startups more broadly, that tend to do POCs, often as in sort of an early proof point. And POCs can either go really well and be really effective, or there's sort of this POC no man's land where young companies can sometimes get stuck. And I would just love your perspective on to what extent you do POCs with startups as a routine part of sort of your evaluation process. And the second piece of that, if you have any advice for startups in terms of how to really nail the POC process so that it actually leads to an actual engagement with the end customer.
You take that?
Sure. So yes, we do POCs. We love POCs. I think every company does, in some shape or form, POCs. I think we call it experimentation budget. We all have it, right? Whether it's, $250,000 or $50,000 somewhere, for us to spend. Because I think if you're not doing that, you're going to lack in innovation and trying to, try a new solution. I think where my advice is aim small, miss small. Like pick an area or a problem that you're trying to solve that's very, very specific. Don't try to solve the large problem or critical areas, because for a POC and for a startup, chances are we're not going to buy, right? So if you say that, for example, you're trying to solve the entire single sign-on authentication business, I'm not going to do it. I really have Okta, right? But if there's a very specific use case where you're trying to solve, say, employee offboarding, right? Maybe, right? It complements something that I already have, and that's worth doing a POC on.
So actually, this is not commonly accepted dogma, but I actually like the idea of paying for a POC as the buyer, because it will help me leverage my own SMEs to actually focus their time and energy on getting it done, because we're paying for something. If it's just a free exercise, every other distraction in the world will come along and people will just say, yeah, can we put that off 2 more weeks? And they're like, we put the data in, but I can't do that until she comes back from vacation and he's here to do X, Y. And that's when you start to have like the 3-month POC, right? And it's not going anywhere. But if you've paid, and I don't mean a lot of money, but if it's like a 5K or a 10K or something like that, I think it's a way to, and use the vendor can make the point, like, I'm giving you my sales engineering talent. They're here to like help walk you, handhold you through the whole experience, and you need to play ball.
Yeah, and I agree with Mark. I mean, like, have to, and you'll know, right? The guys who are really interested, I mean, they'll pay for the POC. We have the money. We will do it if we see value. Yeah. And that way you don't waste, your sales rep and your sales team's time as well, right? I mean, you can very quickly identify the guys who are, just stringing you along, or the guys who are really serious.
I'm curious, just sort of spontaneous show of hands in the room, how many folks here make customers pay for POCs? All right, so
that's good.
A minority, so potentially room to explore that idea, and I like it. You mentioned experimentation and needing to have some room in your budget and in your strategy for experimenting, for innovation. With experimentation, obviously comes risk, right? And when we talk about startups, especially early stage startups, there's this question of risk. So as a CIO, how do you think about risk when it comes to engaging with startups? I mean, in the room today, we have everything from Series A startups all the way to Series D, E, very mature companies. But how do you think about that, and how do you sort of mitigate for that as you sort of look at your overall IT portfolio and the place of earlier stage companies in that?
There's a lot of risks, right? So one risk is skills, on my staff. So if this is some new blockchain solution for predicting the quarterly close in sales, there'll be nobody that really knows like how this works, right? So we could have that kind of a problem. Implementation risk is huge. So when you get around implementation, IT has to worry about, this is really a problem with SaaS tools, the long tail of integrations and other data management and security issues that'll have to be confronted. It's not the day you turn it on, like that is trying to understand that. Day 2 operations, I don't know if that term means a lot to folks here, but again, it's so easy to turn on a SaaS tool that in many times there's confusion between IT and the functional group, who's doing what to who. Are they going to come to us to generate reports out of this thing that they just bought? Are we the data guardians and the data quality gurus for what's going in and out? Or are they going to administer the data and maybe some of the finer grained access procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So I think sometimes we've made this mistake at Okta, but not only at Okta, we've jumped into things without kind of a clear set of rules of engagement of what the business is going to do versus us. And then the last risk, I was actually speaking to the gentleman from Clary at lunch. So I think in IT we tend to underestimate how long it takes to get to the time to business value. And I use Clary as an example. So We had implemented Clary at Okta and had probably been around for like 8 months or maybe 10 months. And as you all know, there's a ton of tools out there to try to predict the quarterly close. I mean, it's all kinds of, and those tools will counsel reps to, like, generate more activity, because then the probability of close is going to go up, et cetera. There's like a whole constellation of these products that are out there. So I started to bring in some startup companies to expose them to the sales guys. And this whole sales organization was like, wait, we just got Clary 8 months ago. The whole sales hierarchy from top to bottom is still learning how to use Clary. We don't feel like we've gotten the business value out of that investment yet. And the last thing we would want to do is get another thing in here and confuse everybody about what the role and responsibility is of the two tools, et cetera. So a lot of times, again, in these kind of conversations, we focus on the IT implementation and the data management and blah, blah. But the time to business value is even a more overriding kind of a concern. And I think we've talked about this among ourselves. It's not IT's role to figure out what sales ops needs. Sales ops is going to figure out what they want and then kind of bring us along for the ride. So that time to real business value is an overriding consideration. Big risk. Go ahead. I didn't mean to monopolize that one.
No. I guess just to add on to that, I think of risk from two lenses. One is customer data. So we have contractual obligations to safekeep our customer data, and on the flip side, also employee data. So if I think about a startup and they're approaching Coupa, in terms of are they going to touch any of that data? I mean, if they are, my initial reaction would be no, right? Because or at least I'm way at the other end of the spectrum. Versus if it's something else like, I don't know, marketing data, sure, go knock yourself out, right? I mean, if you want to buy tools in that space and have some AI, machine learning, ICP risk, like customer profile ranking, go knock yourself out. If it's a tool which tells me that it could predict and risk rank which is my top sales performer, but if it involves giving that company or that startup commission data and a bunch of employee data, I'll probably say no.